On an afternoon like any other, a cup of tea was offered without thought or question. It was warm, familiar, and quietly reassuring. No one noticed the pause before it was poured, or the glance that lingered too long. In villages, such moments pass unseen. Yet this small ritual carried a choice that would unsettle lives and reveal how easily danger hides inside ordinary kindness, when everyone feels perfectly safe. Chapter 1. The afternoon had settled into its usual calm, long before the kettle was placed upon the stove. In this village, afternoons rarely hurried. Time moved at a pace decided by habits rather than clocks. Miss Marple sat near the window of her small sitting room, knitting needles resting idle in her lap. Outside, the hedges stood neatly trimmed, and the road lay empty except for the slow passing of a postman's bicycle. Nothing suggested that this day would differ from any other. And yet something about it felt unsettled, in a way that could not be named. The invitation had arrived that morning, folded carefully and written in a familiar hand. Mrs. Eleanor Harrington was hosting tea at 4:30. There was nothing unusual about that. Mrs. Harrington hosted tea often and prided herself on doing so properly. The village respected her for it. Fine china. Fresh leaves. Cakes baked rather than bought. Miss Marple had attended many such afternoons over the years. Still, she had paused before placing the letter aside. There had been something about the tone, a politeness that felt rehearsed, a warmth that seemed just a touch strained. By 4:15, Miss Marple had put on her coat and hat. She walked slowly along the lane cane, tapping gently against the stones. The Harrington house stood at the bend where the road curved away from the green. It was a solid house built to endure rather than impress. Inside, it always smelled faintly of polish and dried flowers. Today, that scent seemed stronger, almost too carefully maintained. Mrs. Harrington greeted her at the door with a smile that reached her mouth but not her eyes. She was a woman of good posture and firm manners. Her hair was perfectly arranged, her voice steady. Miss Marple noted that her hands were cool when they touched. Cold hands, she thought, often meant nerves or poor circulation. In Mrs. Harrington's case, it was not circulation. They settled into the sitting room where the table had been laid with precision. The teapot stood at the center pale blue with a fine crack along its side. Miss Marple noticed the crack at once. She remembered it from years before. Mrs. Harrington had once mentioned it with annoyance, saying she kept meaning to replace it. And yet, it remained. Old things often stayed because they held meaning beyond usefulness. Other guests arrived shortly after. Miss Lucy Bell from the rectory, Mr. Peter Grant from the nearby cottage. Conversation flowed easily. Remarks about the weather, the coming autumn fair, a comment about the roses. Miss Marple listened more than she spoke. She always did. People revealed themselves when they were not aware of being observed. When the tea was poured, Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Harrington served one cup herself before handing the pot to Miss Bell. It was a small thing. Polite hostesses often did so. Yet, something about the way Mrs. Harrington hesitated before pouring caught Miss Marple's attention, just a fraction of a second. A pause as if considering. The tea itself smelled normal, warm, comforting. Miss Marple lifted the cup and took a careful sip. The taste was familiar, though there was a faint bitterness at the back of the tongue. She said nothing. Bitterness could come from leaves left too long, or from water boiled twice, or from something else entirely. Across the table, Mrs. Harrington watched her guests closely. Not openly, only in brief glances. Her gaze lingered longest on Mr. Grant, whose hands trembled slightly as he lifted his cup. He was a quiet man, usually unremarkable. Today he seemed distracted. He drank more quickly than the others and set his cup down with unusual care. Conversation continued. Miss Bell spoke about a committee meeting. Mr. Grant nodded absently. Mrs. Harrington laughed at appropriate moments. Miss Marple noticed that the hostess herself drank very little. She lifted her cup now and then, but hardly sipped. A habit, perhaps, or a decision. Halfway through the tea, Mr. Grant excused himself, saying he felt unwell. His face had grown pale, and there was a faint sheen of perspiration at his temple. Mrs. Harrington expressed concern. Miss Bell offered sympathy. Miss Marple watched him leave, noting the way Mrs. Harrington's shoulders relaxed once the door closed behind him. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. Cakes were eaten, polite remarks exchanged. When Miss Marple finally rose to leave, Mrs. Harrington accompanied her to the door. There was relief in her manner now. Relief and something else. Satisfaction, perhaps. Or simply the release of tension. Walking home, Miss Marple felt a slight heaviness settle in her chest. Not fear. Not yet. More a recognition. She had seen such moments before, in other places and other lives. Moments where nothing obvious occurred, yet everything had changed. At her gate she paused, looking back toward the Harrington house, now distant and ordinary. A cup of tea, she thought. Such a simple thing. And yet simple things were often the most dangerous, because no one questioned them. She went inside and set her knitting aside. That evening she would replay the afternoon carefully in her mind. Every word, every glance, every pause, because something had been wrong. And Miss Marple had learned long ago that when something felt wrong, it usually was. That evening the village settled into its customary quiet. Lamps were lit behind curtains, and the faint sound of wireless music drifted through open windows. Miss Marple sat in her armchair, hands folded now, no longer knitting. She allowed her thoughts to return to the afternoon, not hurriedly, but with patience. Memories yielded their meaning best when approached gently. She recalled Mrs. Harrington's letter again. The choice of words. The formality where warmth usually lived. Then, the house itself. The smell stronger than usual, as though something had been recently cleaned too thoroughly. Cleanliness, she reflected, often hid anxiety. People cleaned when they wished to control what could not otherwise be controlled. Then there was the teapot. The cracked china still in use despite long-standing irritation. Miss Marple had known many women who clung to old objects, not from sentiment but from stubbornness. Mrs. Harrington disliked waste. She disliked replacement. And yet she also disliked unpredictability. A cracked pot behaved differently when heated. It retained warmth unevenly. That alone might alter the taste, but the taste itself lingered in Miss Marple's memory. That faint bitterness. She had experienced it before once years ago, when a child had accidentally brewed foxglove leaves, thinking them harmless greenery. The memory was distant yet persistent. She dismissed it carefully. One must never leap to conclusions. Imagination was dangerous if not anchored by fact. Her thoughts turned to Mr. Grant. He was not a man given to drama. His sudden illness was out of character. And the way Mrs. Harrington had watched him, that had not been concern alone. There had been anticipation, a waiting for something to occur. Miss Marple rose and prepared herself a cup of her own tea. She used fresh leaves, clean water, her own reliable pot. She tasted it thoughtfully, comforting, ordinary, as tea should be. She sat again and considered motives. Mrs. Harrington was not an unkind woman, nor a foolish one. She was, however, proud. Pride was a powerful force. It could twist reason quietly and thoroughly. She remembered a small conversation from months before when Mrs. Harrington had spoken sharply about property boundaries. Mr. Grant's cottage lay adjacent to her garden. There had been a dispute, a hedge moved by inches, words exchanged politely yet coldly. People often thought serious harm came from passion or greed. Miss Marple knew better. Harm often grew from irritation left to fester, from small slights repeated, from pride wounded publicly. Later that night, news reached the village in murmured fragments. Mr. Grant had taken to his bed. The doctor had been sent for. Nothing too serious, perhaps. A reaction. A weakness. So the word went. Mrs. Harrington expressed deep concern when informed. She offered soup, assistance, kindness. Miss Marple received the news with calm acknowledgement. She said nothing of her suspicions. She would not yet. There was too little to say. But she filed each detail away carefully. Over the next days, she observed quietly. Mrs. Harrington visited Mr. Grant only once and stayed briefly. She spoke often of worry, yet avoided details. Miss Bell mentioned that the doctor had advised rest and observation. No clear diagnosis. Such uncertainty often concealed uncomfortable possibilities. Miss Marple noticed, too, that the teapot was no longer in use. Mrs. Harrington had replaced it suddenly with a new one. A small thing, perhaps, or an attempt to erase an object that had become inconvenient. She walked past the Harrington house one afternoon and saw the old pot wrapped and placed near the dustbin, carelessly for someone who valued her belongings. Miss Marple felt a familiar tightening in her chest. Objects discarded often spoke loudly if one listened. In her sitting room that evening, she made notes, not on paper, but in her mind. The order of events, the behavior before and after, the subtle changes in routine. People believed crimes were loud and obvious. Miss Marple knew they were usually quiet and carefully disguised as normal life. She resolved to watch more closely, to accept invitations, to drink tea when offered, to listen. For if something had indeed been hidden in that cup, it had not yet revealed its full meaning. And whatever had begun with that ordinary afternoon would not end until the truth was gently, but firmly brought to light. Miss Marple sipped her tea and looked out into the darkened lane. The village appeared unchanged. Peaceful. Respectable. But beneath its calm surface something had shifted, and she would uncover it as she always did, patiently, quietly, and without haste. Because evil, she knew, rarely announced itself. It preferred to arrive politely, in a warm cup offered with a steady hand and a practiced smile. Chapter 2. The first thing the village did was soften the story until it could be comfortably swallowed. That was what villages did. They took something sharp and turned it into something rounded. A temporary weakness became a little chill. A sudden collapse became overexertion. A worry became a passing inconvenience. By the time the gossip reached the post office, it had already lost its edge. Miss Marple heard the news from Mrs. Bantry on the morning after the tea. Mrs. Bantry had come by with a basket of apples, and the air of a woman who had walked quickly with purpose. She did not say she had hurried. She simply sat down and began to speak in the way that suggested she had been waiting to speak all morning. "Poor Mr. Grant," she said. "Taken rather queer last night. Doctor was called. Nothing certain yet. Could be a stomach complaint. Could be something he ate. You know how these things are." Miss Marple thanked her and listened. Her face remained calm. Her voice did not invite drama. She asked one small question at a time, as though she were interested only out of ordinary kindness. When did he feel unwell? Had he complained earlier? Who had been with him? Did he vomit? Did he faint? Did he feel dizzy? People answered such questions readily because they believed the answers were harmless. Mrs. Bantry said he had gone home from tea and had seemed pale. Later, he had been found in his kitchen, leaning against the table, unable to stand properly. His neighbor, Mrs. Pritchard, had brought him water. He had been sweating. His hands had trembled. He had complained that his heart felt odd. Dr. Evans had arrived and stayed nearly an hour. Miss Marple nodded slowly. She had known Dr. Evans for years. He was sensible. He did not leap to strange diagnoses. He also disliked embarrassment. If something appeared unusual, he would describe it in ordinary terms until he was forced to do otherwise. After Mrs. Bantry left, Miss Marple walked to the village green. The day looked bright, yet it carried a cold edge. The hedges shone with winter damp. The church clock struck 10 with its familiar steadiness. She paused near the post office and allowed herself to be drawn into conversation. Not like a spider luring prey, more like a woman standing in warmth while others came close on their own. At the counter, she heard the same softened story. Mr. Grant had been unwell. Doctor said it might be a reaction. Perhaps he had taken something that disagreed with him. Mr. Grant lived alone. That always made people suspicious of his habits. Perhaps he had eaten old meat. Perhaps his kettle needed cleaning. Perhaps he was simply not as strong as he used to be. Miss Marple bought stamps and listened. Outside, she saw Mrs. Harrington stepping from her car with a basket on her arm. She looked composed. Her coat was neatly buttoned. Her hair was smooth. She smiled at those who greeted her. Yet Miss Marple noticed the basket was not heavy. A token offering. Not the sort of care that required effort. Mrs. Harrington spotted Miss Marple and approached with polite warmth. She asked if Miss Marple had heard about Mr. Grant. Her voice carried concern in the correct amount. Her eyes did not. How dreadful, she said. Poor man. I do hope he will be better soon. Doctor says he must rest. I am going to drop off a little broth later. Just to be kind. Miss Marple said that was very thoughtful. Mrs. Harrington continued smoothly, as if preparing a small defense, without naming it. She mentioned that the tea had been perfectly ordinary. She had used her usual leaves. She had served everyone the same. Perhaps Mr. Grant had come already feeling unwell. Perhaps he had been worried about something. Stress could do strange things, she said. There was always something in the air these days. Miss Marple agreed calmly. She did not challenge. She watched the way Mrs. Harrington spoke too much too quickly. People who were simply concerned did not feel the need to explain. They asked. They waited. They listened. Mrs. Harrington did none of those things. When Mrs. Harrington left, Miss Marple walked on toward the lane that led to Mr. Grant's cottage. She did not intend to intrude. She simply wished to see the house. A cottage often told the truth about its occupant. Mr. Grant's cottage was small and well kept. The garden was tidy, but not loved. A man's tidy. Practical. He had planted vegetables rather than flowers. There were no curtains drawn back, inviting light. The place had the shut feeling of a home that guarded itself. Mrs. Pritchard was in the garden next door, hanging laundry. She saw Miss Marple and approached eagerly. Mrs. Pritchard liked to be useful. She liked to have knowledge. In a village, knowledge was a kind of currency. He is still poorly, she said at once. Doctor says he must stay warm. His pulse was odd. I heard the doctor say it was like a flutter. That is what he said. A flutter. He also said it could be something he ingested. But he did not want to scare him. Miss Marple asked softly what Mr. Grant had eaten that day. Mrs. Pritchard shrugged. Not much. He said he had tea at Mrs. Harrington's and had a slice of sponge cake. That is all I know. He did not mention dinner. You know how men are. He might have forgotten to eat properly. Perhaps it is just that. Miss Marple nodded. She looked toward the cottage door. It was shut. She could imagine the stillness inside. The smell of cold hearth. The taste of bitterness. The strange, heavy feeling of a heart not behaving as it should. She thanked Mrs. Pritchard and walked back slowly. She felt a quiet certainty growing. Not certainty of guilt yet. Certainty that this was not random. That evening, she wrote a short note to Dr. Evans. Miss Marple did not often write doctor's notes. She knew they were busy, but she had learned that the right question asked gently could lead a person to notice what they had been trying to avoid. Dear Dr. Evans, she wrote. I was concerned to hear Mr. Grant was unwell after yesterday. I wondered if you thought it might be something in the tea. I only asked because I myself found it slightly bitter. With kind regards. She sent it through the post and returned to her chair. Outside, the village grew darker. Inside her house, the lamplight made a small, safe circle. Yet she felt as though she were sitting on the edge of something deeper. In the days ahead, the village would continue to soften the story, but Miss Marple would not. She would hold it as it truly was. A man had been well. He had taken tea. He had gone home and become ill. and someone was too eager to explain why. Mr. Grant did not improve quickly. That was the second thing that unsettled Miss Marple. A simple stomach complaint passed. A chill faded. Even anxiety eased with rest. But this lingered in a way that turned ordinary worry into something sharper. 3 days after the tea, Miss Marple encountered Miss Lucy Bell leaving the rectory with a bundle of papers pressed against her chest. Miss Bell's cheeks were pink from the cold, and from the effort of holding in words she wanted to speak. When she saw Miss Marple, she slowed instantly, as if relieved to have found a listener who would not spill everything at once. "He is still weak," she said. "Mr. Grant." Dr. Evans is puzzled. He says the symptoms are not entirely consistent. That is how he put it. Not entirely consistent. Miss Marple asked what symptoms. Miss Bell hesitated. She did not wish to sound theatrical. She tried to choose sensible words. Palpitations, she said. Trembling. Sweating. Nausea. He had trouble seeing clearly for a time. Doctor says it could be many things, but it came on so suddenly. It came on suddenly, Miss Marple repeated softly. Miss Bell nodded. After tea. They walked together toward the green. Miss Marple kept her pace slow. People spoke more freely when their feet moved gently, and their eyes could look elsewhere. Miss Bell said Dr. Evans had taken a small sample of something. She did not know what. She said he might consult a colleague. But he was careful. He did not want to start rumors. Miss Marple smiled faintly. In a village, rumors began with or without doctors. Often the effort to avoid them only ensured they grew. Later that afternoon, Dr. Evans came to see Miss Marple. That surprised her. Doctors did not usually call on elderly ladies unless required. He arrived in his heavy coat, cheeks red from wind, and his hat in his hands. He accepted tea when offered, but did not drink at once. Miss Marple noticed that. It was a small detail, but it mattered. He spoke politely at first. General remarks. Then he lowered his voice slightly. Your note was sensible, he said. There was bitterness, you say? Yes, Miss Marple replied. Slight. Dr. Evans nodded. I visited Mr. Grant again this morning. The symptoms do resemble something ingested. I do not wish to say more until I know. But I did ask what he consumed. He insists it was nothing unusual. Tea and cake. He says the tea tasted a bit strong, but he thought nothing of it. Miss Marple asked if anyone else had been unwell. No, the doctor said. That complicates it. If it were spoilage or contaminated food, one would expect more than one case. Unless, of course, only one person received something different. He said those last words carefully, as if they were too dangerous to be spoken plainly. Miss Marple did not react outwardly. She said gently that there were always variations in cups. Some people drank more. Some added milk. Some took sugar. Some did not. She watched Dr. Evans's face. He looked tired. A doctor carrying suspicion was a doctor carrying weight. I would like to examine the teapot, he said finally. The one used at Mrs. Harrington's. But I cannot demand such a thing, and if I ask directly, I will create the very situation I am trying to avoid. Miss Marple said quietly that perhaps the teapot might not be available. People disposed of things they no longer wished to see. Dr. Evans frowned. Has she disposed of it? Miss Marple answered honestly, I do not know. But I saw her with a new pot. The doctor looked down at his hands. Then he said something that revealed more than he intended. Mrs. Harrington is not foolish, he said. She is careful. That is what troubles me. A careless person might do something clumsy. A careful person might do something quietly and leave little behind. Miss Marple nodded. It was exactly her own thought. Dr. Evans finished his tea, then stood. He said he would send a sample to the city laboratory. There were tests now that could identify certain plant-based toxins and chemicals. It would take time. In the meantime, Mr. Grant must rest, and the village must remain calm. After he left, Miss Marple sat for a while in silence. The word toxin had not been spoken, but it hung in the air like faint smoke. That night she walked again past the Harrington house. Not creeping, not spying. Simply walking as she often did. The house looked peaceful. A lamp glowed behind lace curtains. The garden lay still. Yet Miss Marple noticed movement near the side gate. A figure crossing briefly from kitchen door toward the shed. It was Mrs. Harrington carrying something wrapped in cloth. Miss Marple slowed. She did not approach. The distance was too great to see clearly. But she saw enough to know that Mrs. Harrington was not carrying broth. The next morning news came that Mr. Grant had tried to stand and had nearly fallen. His legs were weak. His hands shook again. Dr. Evans stayed longer this time. Miss Bell was called to assist, as she often did when someone needed errands done. She visited later and returned looking troubled. "He is frightened," she told Miss Marple in a low voice. "Not of illness alone. He said he remembers a strange taste in the tea, bitter like metal. He wondered if it had been deliberate, but he felt foolish saying it. He said no one would do such a thing over a hedge dispute. Not in our village." Miss Marple held her gaze steady. She said people did not always act according to what seemed reasonable. Miss Bell lowered her voice further. "He also said something else. He said when he left Mrs. Harrington's, he saw her in the kitchen doorway watching him. Not waving, just watching. He said it felt as though she was checking, that he had taken enough." Miss Marple felt a small chill move through her. Not fear. Confirmation. Later that day, Mrs. Harrington visited Miss Marple unexpectedly. She arrived with a plate of biscuits and an expression of friendliness that was a touch too bright. She spoke at once about Mr. Grant. Poor man. So unfortunate. She said she had heard foolish talk. People speculating about the tea. Imagine, she said. Imagine anyone suggesting such a thing. Miss Marple offered her a chair and listened. Mrs. Harrington continued. "I pride myself on my tea," she said. "I would never serve anything harmful. And really one must consider that Mr. Grant lives alone. He does not eat properly. He forgets meals. He might drink too much strong tea at home as well. One cannot blame everything on a hostess." Miss Marple nodded politely. She did not argue. She merely asked whether the old cracked teapot had finally been replaced. Mrs. Harrington's smile held for a second, then tightened. "Yes," she said. "It was time." "Where is the old one now?" Miss Marple asked with mild curiosity. Mrs. Harrington looked away. "Disposed of," she said quickly. "It was cracked. It could not be trusted." Miss Marple stirred her own tea slowly. She said nothing more. But the answer told her what she needed. Not that the pot itself was proof, only that Mrs. Harrington had anticipated the question. After Mrs. Harrington left, Miss Marple sat quietly. She could hear the faint tick of her clock. Outside, the lane remained peaceful. Yet she felt as if the village itself had begun to lean away from something. Leaning away was what people did when truth threatened comfort. Mr. Grant remained unwell. Dr. Evans waited for results. Mrs. Harrington spoke too much, and Miss Marple now understood the shape of the danger. It was not only the illness, it was the way the village wanted to deny the possibility of deliberate harm. That denial was a shield for the wrong person. It made wickedness safe. She looked down at her cup. The tea had cooled. She lifted it and drank. Calmly, thoughtfully. If evil had indeed been hidden in a cup, it would not be exposed by panic or accusation. It would be exposed by patience. And patience Miss Marple had in abundance. Chapter 3. The village liked to believe that the past stayed where it belonged. Tidy. Closed. Safely tucked behind polite smiles and trimmed hedges. Miss Marple had never believed that. In her experience, the past did not remain quiet. It waited. And when given the smallest opportunity, it spoke again through ordinary things. A glance. A tone. A cup of tea. On the morning Dr. Evans received the laboratory report, Miss Marple was already awake and sitting near her window. She had slept poorly, not from worry, but from thought. Her mind had been busy arranging pieces, not into accusation, but into understanding. That was always the first step. Understanding came before judgment. The report itself did not name a poison. It did not offer dramatic conclusions. It suggested the presence of a plant-based compound that could affect the heart when taken in small quantities. Not enough to kill necessarily. Enough to weaken. Enough to frighten. Enough to cause harm without drawing immediate suspicion. Dr. Evans did not share the details with the village. He shared them only with Miss Marple. There are plants, he said, that grow commonly in gardens. People forget they are dangerous. A leaf here. A small amount steeped too long. It could be accidental. But accidents leave patterns. This did not feel accidental. Miss Marple listened. She did not interrupt. She thought of Mrs. Harrington's garden. Well kept. Traditional. Full of plants that had been there long before modern caution. She remembered seeing foxglove near the back fence years ago. Tall, elegant flowers admired for their beauty rather than feared for their nature. Dr. Evans said he would speak to Mrs. Harrington again. He would ask gently. He would mention nothing about intention, only about safety. Miss Marple knew this approach well. It was how one tested reactions without accusations. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked past the Harrington garden deliberately. Not to inspect, not to search, simply to see. She saw that the area near the fence had been recently disturbed. Soil turned. A space where tall flowers had once grown now bare. A gardener removing plants for winter, perhaps, or removing something else entirely. Mrs. Harrington emerged as if summoned by thought alone. She greeted Miss Marple with cordiality. She commented on the weather. She spoke of how unpleasant illness could be. She did not mention the garden. Miss Marple remarked gently that the foxgloves had been removed. Mrs. Harrington paused. Only for a moment. Yes, she said. They were untidy. And really one must be careful with such things. Children and animals, you know. It was a sensible explanation. Too sensible. Miss Marple nodded and moved on. Later, she sat with Miss Bell at the rectory. Miss Bell was sorting papers for a charity sale. She spoke absent-mindedly about arrangements, then suddenly stopped and frowned. Do you remember, she asked, when Mrs. Harrington first moved into that house? Miss Marple did. Miss Bell continued. There was some trouble then. With her sister. I had forgotten until now. They fell out badly. It was over the house. Over inheritance. Mrs. Harrington remained. The sister left and never returned. People said harsh things were said. That threats were made. But it was all smoothed over. People always smooth things over. Miss Marple remembered the sister vaguely. A sharper woman. Less polished. One who did not hide irritation well. She remembered, too, that the sister had been the one who loved gardening. Who had planted foxgloves deliberately despite warnings, because she admired their elegance. Miss Marple asked quietly whether Mr. Grant had been involved in that time. Miss Bell hesitated. She nodded slowly. He had been a witness, she said. In a dispute about the boundary, he sided with the sister. It caused embarrassment. Mrs. Harrington never forgave that. Embarrassment, pride, memory. Miss Marple felt the past slide neatly into place. Mrs. Harrington's careful life had been shaped by that earlier humiliation. A sister who left, a neighbor who witnessed, a village that remembered quietly. She visited Mr. Grant that evening. It was the first time she had done so. He looked thinner, his face drawn. His hands still trembled slightly. He was embarrassed by his weakness. Men often were. She spoke calmly, asked about ordinary things, then gently asked about the past, about the house, about the boundary dispute years ago. At first, he laughed weakly. He said it was nothing now. Long forgotten. But his eyes told another story. She pressed no further. She did not need to. The memory had already been stirred. When she left, he called after her quietly. He said there had been a time when Mrs. Harrington had told him she never forgot betrayal. He had thought it dramatic then. He did not think so now. Miss Marple walked home as dusk fell. She felt the weight of inevitability settle. Not of outcome, of truth. The past had not remained buried. It had been steeped slowly and served warm years later. And someone had believed that enough time had passed to make it safe. Once the past had been acknowledged, it began to speak more freely. Miss Marple did not hurry this process. She allowed conversations to drift naturally toward memory. People were often relieved to speak of what they had once chosen to forget. Mrs. Bantry remembered now that Mrs. Harrington's sister had accused her of being cold, calculating, capable of anything when crossed. Mrs. Bantry laughed as she said it. She added that sisters always said such things. But her laughter lacked conviction. Mrs. Pritchard recalled the garden arguments. The hedge line, the raised voices quickly lowered when others approached. She remembered Mrs. Harrington standing very straight, very calm, while her sister shouted. She remembered thinking then that calmness could be frightening. Miss Marple listened. She wove nothing herself. She allowed the village to weave its own tapestry from threads long hidden. Dr. Evans visited again with more clarity. The substance, he said, could have been derived from a common garden plant. Steeped improperly. Delivered in liquid. Tea was an efficient method. The dose suggested intention. Not enough to kill. Enough to frighten. Enough to weaken. Why not kill Miss Marple? Asked gently. Dr. Evans considered. Perhaps because death would draw scrutiny. Illness could be explained away. People wanted explanations that did not disturb them. Miss Marple nodded. She thought of Mrs. Harrington's manner. Controlled. Measured. She would not wish to be seen as dramatic. She would prefer harm that looked like misfortune. That afternoon, Miss Marple received an invitation. Mrs. Harrington requested her presence for tea again. A small gathering, she said. Just a few friends. To reassure everyone. To show normality. Miss Marple read the letter carefully. The wording was confident. Almost defiant. As if daring suspicion to surface. She knew then what Mrs. Harrington intended. Not harm. Proof of innocence. She wished to demonstrate that tea was harmless. That the idea of danger was absurd. Miss Marple accepted. Before the day arrived, she visited Dr. Evans. She told him she believed Mrs. Harrington would attempt to recreate the situation. Not to harm. To disprove. Dr. Evans listened gravely. He agreed to be nearby. The afternoon of the second tea arrived with pale sunlight and a stillness that felt expectant. Miss Marple entered the Harrington house again. The room was arranged as before, but the teapot was new. Shiny. Uncracked. Mrs. Harrington served with confidence. Miss Marple watched closely. She noticed that Mrs. Harrington poured her own cup last this time. That she drank fully. That she smiled. Others drank too. No one became ill. Conversation flowed. Mrs. Harrington appeared triumphant. Yet Miss Marple noticed something else. Mrs. Harrington avoided the back of the garden. The area where foxgloves had grown remained bare. Too bare. Too recently disturbed. After tea, Miss Marple walked through the garden with Mrs. Harrington. She remarked on the cleared soil. Mrs. Harrington stiffened. She said she planned to replant in spring. Miss Marple asked calmly where the old plants had gone. Composted, Mrs. Harrington replied quickly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Composting foxglove was not advised. Someone as careful as Mrs. Harrington would know that. Unless care had failed her when fear intervened. That evening, Dr. Evans reported that Miss Grant's condition had stabilized. Slowly. He would recover, but weakness might remain. Damage sometimes lingered. Miss Marple sat with her thoughts. The truth was now clear. The method, the motive, the restraint. What remained was the moral weight. The village would not want a scandal. They would want quiet resolution. She understood then what she must do. She would not expose Mrs. Harrington publicly, not unless forced. She would confront her privately. Offer a choice. admission without spectacle, consequence without destruction. For Mrs. Harrington's greatest fear was not prison. It was exposure. It was the village seeing her not as careful and composed, but as capable of harm. The past had shaped her into someone who believed control justified cruelty. Miss Marple would show her otherwise. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple felt no triumph, only sadness. This had not been a crime of passion. It had been a crime of patience. And those were always the most dangerous because they hid so well behind everyday kindness. She looked again at her teacup. It reflected the lamplight softly, innocent, ordinary. She knew now that ordinary things carried the weight of memory. And when memory was fed slowly, it could poison even the gentlest ritual. Tomorrow she would speak to Mrs. Harrington alone. And the past would finally be acknowledged for what it was. Chapter 4. By the fourth day, the village had settled into a peculiar stillness. It was not peace. It was avoidance. Doors opened and closed at their usual times. Greetings were exchanged with familiar warmth. Yet beneath it all lay a quiet agreement not to look too closely. Everyone knew something was wrong. Everyone chose not to name it. Miss Marple sensed this immediately. She had lived long enough to recognize the difference between calm and silence. Calm was natural. Silence was deliberate. She encountered it first at the grocer's. Conversation stopped the moment she entered, then resumed with exaggerated normality. Apples were discussed. Prices lamented. Weather predicted. No one mentioned Mr. Grant. No one mentioned tea. Miss Marple purchased her items and lingered just long enough for discomfort to rise. People did not like lingering. It forced them to acknowledge what they wished to ignore. Outside, she met Mrs. Pritchard, who immediately began speaking about laundry as though it were urgent news. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. Miss Marple waited. She did not interrupt. At last, Mrs. Pritchard lowered her voice. "People are saying it is better not to talk," she said. "Dr. Evans told us not to worry. Mrs. Harrington says rumors can harm a village." Miss Marple nodded. Rumors could indeed harm a village. So could silence. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited Mr. Grant again. He was stronger now, but the strength felt borrowed. His movements were careful. His voice measured. He smiled too quickly. He said the village had been kind. Too kind. People brought food. They asked after him politely. They did not ask questions. That troubled him more than illness. He said he felt as though everyone had decided what he must not say. Miss Marple asked what he believed. He hesitated. He said he believed he had been harmed deliberately. He said he did not know why. Then he corrected himself. He said he did know why, but did not want to accept it. She did not push. Acceptance came when one was ready. She asked instead whether anyone had suggested he should remain quiet. He nodded. Not directly. Indirectly. He said phrases like "best not to stir things," and "the village needs peace" had been spoken more than once. Peace, Miss Marple thought, often meant comfort for those who feared exposure. That evening, she received another invitation from Mrs. Harrington. This time, it was not for tea. It was for a quiet walk. Mrs. Harrington wished to speak privately. Miss Marple expected this. When people realized they were being observed, they often sought control through conversation. They walked along the lane as dusk approached. Mrs. Harrington spoke first. She spoke of how upsetting illness could be, of how rumors hurt innocent people, of how villagers had a responsibility to protect one another from speculation. Miss Marple listened. She said nothing. Mrs. Harrington continued. She said some people misinterpreted kindness. She said accidents happened. She said the past should remain buried. Her voice remained calm, but her pace quickened slightly. Miss Marple remarked gently that the past rarely remained buried if it had been buried without honesty. Mrs. Harrington stopped walking. She turned. Her face remained composed, but the muscles around her mouth tightened. She said Miss Marple always saw more than was necessary. She said sometimes it was kinder not to see. Miss Marple replied softly that kindness built on denial often protected the wrong person. They stood there in the fading light, the lane empty, the hedges whispering faintly in the breeze. Mrs. Harrington said the village trusted her. She said she had done nothing wrong. She said there was no proof. She said Mr. Grant was weak and prone to imagination. She said Dr. Evans had not accused her. She said Miss Marple was creating trouble where none existed. Miss Marple met her gaze steadily. She said she did not need proof yet. She needed understanding. She said she understood why Mrs. Harrington felt wronged in the past. She said she understood how pride hardened when humiliation lingered. She said she understood how careful people believed themselves entitled to quiet solutions. Mrs. Harrington's composure wavered then. Just slightly. Enough. She said coldly that understanding was not evidence. She said Miss Marple could ruin lives with her suspicions. Miss Marple answered calmly that some lives were already damaged. Mr. Grant's, for one. Mrs. Harrington turned away abruptly and walked back toward her house. The conversation was over. Control had slipped, and she would not risk further exposure. Miss Marple returned home knowing something important had occurred. Mrs. Harrington had not denied the past. She had not expressed confusion. She had expressed anger. That night, Miss Marple sat awake, listening to the clock. The village around her slept, or pretended to. She knew now that the village itself had become part of the problem. By choosing silence, it had shielded harm. By prioritizing peace, it had accepted injustice. Tomorrow, she would act. Not dramatically, not publicly, but decisively. Because sometimes the greatest danger was not the person who committed harm. It was the many who chose not to see it. Morning arrived with a thin gray light and the quiet weight of decision. Miss Marple rose early. She dressed carefully as though preparing for something ceremonial rather than confrontational. She believed appearances mattered. They set the tone. Calm invited truth more effectively than force ever could. Her first visit was to Dr. Evans. She told him plainly that the village was closing ranks, that Mrs. Harrington felt protected by silence, that Mr. Grant would recover but would never feel safe while the truth remained unspoken. Dr. Evans listened gravely. He admitted he had felt pressure already. Subtle pressure. Suggestions that he should describe the illness vaguely. That certainty would cause unnecessary trouble. He disliked being pushed. Doctors did not like having their judgment shaped by social comfort. Miss Marple suggested a gathering. Not formal, not accusatory. A simple meeting of those most involved. Mrs. Harrington, Mr. Grant if he felt able, Miss Bell, himself. She said the truth needed witnesses, not spectators. Dr. Evans agreed. That afternoon letters were delivered quietly. No announcement, no gossip. Only invitations framed as concern for Mr. Grant's well-being. When they gathered, it was in Dr. Evans's sitting room. Neutral ground. The chairs were arranged loosely. Tea was offered, but no one drank much. The air felt heavy, though voices remained polite. Mrs. Harrington arrived last. She greeted everyone warmly. She took her seat with practiced grace. She smiled as though confident. Dr. Evans began by speaking clinically. He described the illness, the symptoms, the likelihood of ingestion. He spoke carefully. He avoided accusation. But his words narrowed the possibilities until they could no longer be ignored. Mr. Grant listened in silence. His face pale. His hands folded tightly. Miss Bell watched anxiously. Mrs. Harrington remained composed. When Dr. Evans finished, Miss Marple spoke, not accusing, not emotional. She spoke of the past, of the boundary dispute, of the sister who left, of the humiliation that lingered. She spoke of foxgloves and bitterness and careful people who believed restraint justified harm. Mrs. Harrington interrupted sharply. She said this was conjecture. She said it was cruel. She said Miss Marple was abusing her reputation. Miss Marple turned to Mr. Grant. She asked him to speak if he wished. He hesitated, then spoke quietly. He said he remembered Mrs. Harrington watching him leave. He said he remembered the taste. He said he had dismissed it at first because he trusted her. His voice shook when he said that. The room fell silent. Mrs. Harrington's composure finally fractured. Not loudly, not dramatically. It fractured in a way that revealed exhaustion. She said she had never intended serious harm. She said she only wanted to frighten him, to weaken him, to remind him of consequences. She said she had felt powerless for years. She said she had convinced herself it was justified. Miss Marple said gently that justification did not lessen harm. Mrs. Harrington's shoulders slumped. She looked suddenly older. She said she had believed the village would protect her, that people preferred comfort to truth. She said she had been right. Dr. Evans said quietly that this matter could not be ignored, that consequences would follow. He said he would report the facts appropriately. Mrs. Harrington did not argue. She seemed relieved. Exposure had arrived at last, and with it release. When they left, Mr. Grant thanked Miss Marple softly. He said he felt lighter, despite weakness. Truth had done that. Miss Marple walked home alone. The village looked unchanged. Hedges trimmed, doors closed, lamps lit. But something fundamental had shifted. People would talk now. They would struggle. They would feel betrayed. Yet, they would also learn. Miss Marple sat in her chair and poured herself a cup of tea. She tasted it thoughtfully. Ordinary. Safe. She reflected that evil rarely appeared as monsters. It appeared as people who believed themselves careful and justified, and villages often enabled them by choosing comfort over courage. This time, comfort had not won, and though the village would heal it, would not forget. Nor should it. Miss Marple sipped her tea calmly, knowing the quiet trap was nearly complete. Chapter 5. The village woke the next morning with the uneasy feeling that follows a night of unspoken change. Nothing visible had altered. The hedges remained trimmed. The lane curved gently as it always had. The church bell rang at its usual hour. Yet beneath these familiar signs lay an awareness that something once hidden had surfaced and could not be pressed back into silence. Miss Marple sensed it as she moved through her routine. People greeted her with unusual attentiveness. Some smiles lingered too long. Others flickered briefly, then vanished. She knew these expressions well. They belonged to people reassessing what they thought they knew about themselves and their neighbors. Mrs. Harrington did not leave her house that morning. Curtains remained drawn longer than usual. Her car stayed in the drive. The house that had once felt immaculate now felt closed. Not defensive. Withdrawn. Miss Marple understood the distinction. Defense sought to repel scrutiny. Withdrawal accepted its arrival. Mr. Grant remained indoors as well, though his condition had improved slightly. Dr. Evans visited early. Miss Bell brought fresh bread. There was a sense of care now that felt genuine rather than polite. People were no longer avoiding him. They were acknowledging him. Miss Marple visited in the afternoon. Mr. Grant looked tired but clearer. His eyes followed her movement with alertness. He said the night had been the first in days when he slept without waking in fear. The knowledge that he had not imagined the danger had steadied him. He spoke then of something that surprised her. He said Mrs. Harrington had visited briefly that morning. She had not defended herself. She had not explained. She had apologized. Simply. Without condition. He said it was the first honest thing she had said to him in years. Miss Marple nodded. She knew apologies offered after exposure were complicated things. They could be sincere. They could also be a means of regaining dignity. Often they were both. As she walked home, Miss Marple reflected on Mrs. Harrington's actions. The quiet removal of foxgloves. The replacement of the teapot. The second tea invitation. These had not been careless gestures. They had been deliberate attempts to demonstrate control. Mrs. Harrington had believed that by recreating normality she could erase suspicion. She had not understood that normality repeated under strain often revealed cracks more clearly than chaos. Later that day, Dr. Evans called again. He informed Miss Marple that authorities would be notified. The matter would be handled discreetly but formally. Mrs. Harrington would face consequences, though perhaps not public trial. Her age, her health, her lack of prior offenses would be considered. Justice would arrive quietly as the harm itself had been delivered. Miss Marple thanked him. She felt no satisfaction, only resolution. That evening the village gathered informally on the green, not by design, simply because people found themselves drawn there. Conversations formed in small clusters. No one spoke loudly, no one accused, but names were mentioned. Questions asked. Boundaries shifted. Mrs. Bantry remarked that she had always thought Mrs. Harrington severe. Mrs. Pritchard said she remembered the garden disputes. Miss Bell admitted she had once felt uneasy in Mrs. Harrington's presence without knowing why. Miss Marple listened. She did not guide. She allowed understanding to emerge naturally. People learned more effectively when they believed they had reached conclusions themselves. As dusk settled, Miss Marple walked back to her cottage. The sky darkened gently. Lights appeared one by one behind windows. She felt the familiar comfort of routine returning, yet she knew the village would not be quite the same again. And that was necessary. Inside her sitting room, she prepared tea. She handled the leaves carefully, measured the water. She had always believed rituals mattered most when they were treated with respect. A ritual abused could become dangerous. She sat and drank slowly. Her thoughts turned briefly to Mrs. Harrington alone in her house, facing consequences she had long avoided. Miss Marple felt compassion tempered by clarity. Harm committed quietly still required acknowledgement. She also thought of the village, of how easily it had chosen silence, of how quickly it had learned better. The trap had not been dramatic. There had been no confrontation filled with raised voices. No sudden revelations shouted in public spaces. The trap had been patience, observation, the willingness to wait while truth revealed itself. Miss Marple believed that was the only kind of trap that truly held. In the days that followed, life resumed its familiar rhythm, though, with subtle differences. People spoke more openly, not only about the incident, but about other things long left unsaid. Small grievances surfaced and were resolved. Old misunderstandings were clarified. It was as though the village had learned that silence was not always protective. Mrs. Harrington left her house one morning, escorted quietly by Dr. Evans and a uniformed officer. There were no crowds. No whispers shouted. Only a few people standing at windows, watching with expressions that mixed regret and acceptance. She did not look at them. Her gaze remained forward, her posture upright. Miss Marple watched from a distance. She did not feel vindicated. She felt a sober calm. Justice, when done quietly, often left little room for emotion. Mr. Grant recovered steadily, though the doctor warned him that full strength might take time. He accepted this with surprising peace. He said the weight he had carried was gone. He said weakness felt manageable now that fear had lifted. Miss Marple visited him often during his recovery. They spoke of ordinary things: gardening, weather, books. One afternoon he asked her whether she had known from the start. She answered honestly, "No, I suspected something early. But suspicion must be tested gently. Otherwise it becomes imagination." He nodded. He said he had wanted to believe nothing was wrong. That belief had nearly harmed him further. Miss Marple said belief was powerful, but truth was steadier. As the weeks passed, the village adapted. Mrs. Harrington's house stood empty for a time. Some suggested it should be sold. Others thought it best left alone. Eventually, arrangements were made quietly. The house would change hands. New life would move in. The past would not be erased, but it would no longer dominate the present. Miss Marple returned to her routines, knitting by the window, walking the lane, accepting invitations, declining others. Life regained its gentle pace. Yet she noticed a difference in how people offered tea. They were more attentive, more thoughtful. Cups were filled carefully. Hosts drank alongside guests. Conversations paused when someone hesitated. A small but meaningful change. One afternoon, Miss Bell visited Miss Marple bringing scones. They sat together and spoke about how the village had changed. Miss Bell said she believed people had learned something important. That kindness required honesty to remain safe. Miss Marple agreed. As Miss Bell left, she paused and said something that stayed with Miss Marple. She said people often thought danger arrived loudly. She said she would never look at ordinary rituals the same way again. Miss Marple smiled. That was as it should be. That evening, Miss Marple sat alone with her tea. The cup warmed her hands. The taste was comforting. She reflected that the greatest trap had not been the one she set, but the one Mrs. Harrington had fallen into herself. The belief that careful harm could remain hidden. That control equaled safety. In truth, harm grew more dangerous when it was subtle, when it disguised itself as care. Miss Marple finished her tea and rinsed the cup. She placed it neatly on the rack. Order restored. Not perfectly. Never perfectly. But honestly. Outside the village settled into night. Lamps glowed softly. The lane lay quiet. The trap was complete. Not because someone had been caught, but because truth had been allowed to stand without disguise. And that was always the most enduring resolution. Chapter 6. The first day of proper winter sunlight arrived almost without warning. After weeks of gray, the sky opened into a pale, clean blue, and the village looked newly washed. Frost glittered on hedges. Smoke rose in thin lines from chimneys. Even the stones of the lane seemed brighter, as if they too had been relieved of something heavy. Miss Marple noticed such things. She had always believed the world gave signs when a chapter ended. Not dramatic signs. Quiet ones. A clearer sky. A steadier a cup of tea that tasted only of tea. She was knitting near the window when the post arrived. Among the bills and circulars lay an envelope addressed in a firm, familiar hand. She did not open it at once. She recognized the handwriting. She set her knitting aside and sat very still for a moment, as if allowing herself to acknowledge what the letter represented. It was from Mrs. Harrington. The letter was short. It contained no excuses, no bitterness, no argument. It said she wished to write before arrangements were finalized. She said she was leaving the county. She said she accepted responsibility and would comply with whatever was required. She said she wanted Miss Marple to know she had not intended death. She had intended power. She had been ashamed to admit that. She was ashamed still. She said she was sorry for what she had done to Mr. Grant. She said she was sorry for what she had done to the village by forcing it to see something it did not wish to see. Miss Marple read it twice. Then she folded it neatly and placed it in her drawer. She did not feel satisfaction. She did not feel anger. She felt a quiet sorrow that a woman who valued respectability had allowed herself to become capable of cruelty in order to protect pride. Later that morning, Dr. Evans visited. He brought practical updates. The matter had been resolved legally in the quiet way he had anticipated. Mrs. Harrington would be required to remain under supervision for a period. She would not return to the village. The details would not be posted publicly. Yet the record would exist. Consequences would remain. He said he felt relief. He also said he felt unsettled. He had always considered Mrs. Harrington difficult, but he had not imagined her capable of deliberate harm. Miss Marple answered calmly that imagination often failed when it came to the gentle face of wrongdoing. People believed wickedness announced itself. It rarely did. It dressed in good manners and clean linen and spoke politely about tea. Dr. Evans nodded grimly. He told her that Mr. Grant's heart rhythm had stabilized. There might be lingering fatigue, but no lasting danger. Mr. Grant would live. Those words mattered. Miss Marple felt her shoulders loosen slightly. She had not realized until then how much tension she had carried. The danger had passed. The story's most serious consequence would not be death. That, too, was a kind of mercy. In the afternoon, Miss Marple walked to Mr. Grant's cottage. He was outside for the first time in many days, standing in the thin sunlight, with his coat buttoned high. He looked smaller but steadier. When he saw her, he smiled slowly like a man remembering how to feel safe. They sat on a bench near his garden. He spoke of ordinary things at first. The birds returning. The soil needing attention. The slow loss of strength in his arms. Miss Marple listened and allowed him to guide the conversation. Eventually, he said he had received a note from Mrs. Harrington as well. He had not shown it to anyone. He had not even told Mrs. Pritchard. He said the apology had surprised him. Not because she was incapable of regret, but because she had been incapable of humility for so long. Miss Marple asked how he felt. He looked away toward the hedge line that had caused so much bitterness over the years. He said he felt tired. He said he felt angry sometimes. He said he also felt strangely calm. He said knowing the truth meant he no longer had to fight shadows. Miss Marple nodded. Shadows were exhausting. Truth could be heavy, but it stood still. One could walk around it. One could leave it behind. As she walked home, she noticed the village had begun to restore itself. Not by forgetting, by adjusting. People greeted one another with more candor. Small kindnesses felt more genuine. Even gossip carried a different tone. Less eager. More cautious. Miss Marple thought of the ritual of tea. How it was offered. How it was received. How easily it had been used as a weapon precisely because it was trusted. She hoped the village would not become fearful of tea itself. Fear of ordinary things could distort life. But she also hoped they would become wiser. That they would understand trust must be earned daily, not assumed forever. That evening, Miss Marple poured herself tea and sat in her chair. The lamplight made a soft circle in the room. Outside, the lane lay quiet. She drank slowly, feeling warmth spread through her hands. A cup of tea had hid a dark secret. Not because tea was dangerous, but because people could hide anything in the most ordinary places when others were determined not to look. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly and listened to the faint sounds of the house settling. The story was nearly finished. Yet she knew the lesson would linger. Not as fear, as attention. The final days of the matter unfolded with the kind of quiet order that the village prized. There were forms, meetings in small offices, conversations held behind closed doors. A decision reached without spectacle. The village did not gather to witness it. That was partly mercy. It was also habit. People preferred endings that did not disturb the surface of their lives. Miss Marple understood that preference. She simply did not allow it to become a veil again. One morning she was invited to the rectory for tea. Miss Bell's invitation felt different from Mrs. Harrington's. It was warm, unforced. It carried no hidden urgency. Miss Marple accepted. She knew this tea was not a test. It was a restoration. When she arrived, Miss Bell had set the table simply. No grand arrangement. No performance. A plain pot. Fresh bread. A jar of honey. The atmosphere was gentle and honest. They spoke first about the charity sale. Then about Mr. Grant's recovery. Then finally about Mrs. Harrington. Miss Bell admitted she felt pity. She also felt anger. She said she could not reconcile the two. Miss Marple said they could exist together. Pity for the person. Anger for the act. One did not erase the other. Miss Bell asked how such a thing could happen in their village. In a place so familiar. So safe. Miss Marple answered carefully. She said places were not safe by nature. They were made safe by attention. By honesty. By willingness to ask gentle questions even when questions were uncomfortable. Miss Bell nodded slowly. She said she had always believed politeness was kindness. Now she saw politeness could also be avoidance. Miss Marple agreed. Politeness could be a beautiful thing when it came from respect. It became dangerous when it became a shield. When she left the rectory, she walked along the lane and noticed children playing near the green. Their laughter drifted through the cold air. The village looked alive again. The fear that had hovered quietly had lifted. Not because nothing had happened, but because it had been faced. At Mr. Grant's cottage, the garden gate stood open. He was inside, but a light burned in the kitchen. Miss Marple paused and looked at the open gate. A small symbol. A man who no longer needed to lock himself against the world. She returned home and found another letter waiting. This one from a solicitor. It contained formal details. Mrs. Harrington's house would be sold. The proceeds would go partly toward Mr. Grant's care, and partly to a fund the village maintained for those in need. The arrangement was discreet yet meaningful. A quiet attempt at repair. Miss Marple sat down and read it twice. She felt again that mixture of sorrow and relief. Repair could never undo the harm. It could only acknowledge it. That evening she walked to the churchyard. Not out of drama. Simply because she liked the stillness there. The stones stood in rows, reminding her how short and fragile life could be. She stood near an old grave and thought of the many lives she had watched. Lives ruined by pride. Lives saved by small acts of honesty. Lives altered forever by ordinary moments. A cup of tea. A crack in a teapot. A pause before pouring. These had been the true turning points. Not storms. Not accidents. Not loud violence. Quiet choices. She returned home as dusk deepened. She lit her lamp and made tea once more. This time she allowed herself to feel gratitude. Not for the event, for its outcome. For the fact that Mr. Grant lived. For the fact that the village had been forced to look at itself and had not turned away completely. She lifted the cup and inhaled the scent. Warm leaves. Clean water. Nothing hidden. She spoke softly to the empty room, as if addressing one listener alone. She said that people often believed darkness lived in distant places and dangerous strangers. In truth, it often lived in familiar rooms behind familiar smiles. It lived in the space between what people sensed and what they dared to say. Miss Marple drank and set the cup down. The warmth remained in her hands. Outside, the village settled into night once more. Lamps glowed. Curtains were drawn. The world returned to its quiet rhythm. Yet, Miss Marple knew something had changed for the better. Not because evil had been defeated forever. Evil would always exist wherever human pride existed, but because the village had learned that comfort should never be valued more than truth. And that knowledge would remain. A cup of tea could be a comfort again. Not because it had always been harmless, but because now the village understood that trust was not a gift given once. It was a choice renewed each day. Miss Marple looked out into the dark lane and allowed herself a small, calm smile. The secret had been exposed, the ritual restored, the lesson learned, and so the village returned to its ordinary life. A little wiser, a little braver, and far more awake. The village did not mark the ending with ceremony. There was no final gathering and no spoken declaration that things were now settled. Instead, life resumed its gentle patterns one careful day at a time. Doors opened. Tea was offered. Conversations returned to weather and gardens and small concerns that felt safe again. Miss Marple understood that this was how true endings arrived. Quietly, without insistence. Mr. Grant recovered enough to tend his garden once more. His movements were slower, but steadier. He smiled more easily now, that he no longer doubted his own instincts. Mrs. Harrington's house stood ready for new occupants, and with them new stories that would not carry the weight of old resentments. Miss Marple returned fully to her routines, knitting by the window, walking the lane, listening more than speaking. Yet she noticed the subtle change in how people lived. They paused before dismissing unease. They listened more carefully when something felt wrong. Politeness remained, but it was no longer used as a wall. One evening, Miss Marple prepared tea and sat quietly as the cup warmed her hands. She reflected that danger had not come from malice alone, but from the willingness of many to look away. And safety had returned not through force, but through attention and honesty. She sipped calmly. The tea tasted ordinary. As it should. Outside the village settled into peaceful night, carrying with it a lesson learned gently but firmly. Some secrets could hide anywhere, but once seen they lost their power. And Miss Marple knew that was enough.